All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our monthly College of Natural Sciences webinar. My name is Allison Sherwood. I'm the Interim Associate Dean for the college, and through our Pilina webinar series, we are opening up our research that's happening within the College of Natural Sciences and also that's happening across the broader Manoa campus, and hoping to show this to everybody. So today's event features two presenters. We have Dr. Cali Crampton with the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project and Dr. Hanna Mounce with the Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project. Both programs are part of the Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit, which is based in the College of Natural Sciences. Dr. Cali Crampton has been the project leader of the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project since April 2010, where she oversees research into the ecology and conservation of Kauai's endangered forest birds. She obtained her PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from the University of Nevada at Reno in December 2004, and then worked on Hawaii Island and in the Sierra Nevadas before beginning her current position. Her current efforts include mosquito and disease surveys to inform landscape level mosquito control to prevent extinction of Hawaiian honeycreepers and studying the impact of controlling invasive rats on Kauai's forest birds. Dr. Hanna Mounce is the Research Management Project Coordinator with the Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project. Dr. Mounce started working on the conservation of Hawaiian honeycreepers in 2006. She developed a passion for island ecosystems while completing her undergraduate degree at Humboldt State, California, and Lincoln University in New Zealand. She then completed her doctorate at the University of Kent. To further conservation efforts and access to private funding, Hanna also spearheaded the incorporation of Nakoa Manu conservation in 2015. While coordinating the recovery actions for the kiwikiu, or the Maui parrotbill, Dr. Mounce also manages forest restoration and mosquito control implementation plans and actions on Maui, and oversees the Alala project, works with an active volunteer program, and develops public outreach for the Hawaii community and beyond. And so now I'd like to turn our time over to Drs. Crampton and Mounce for their presentation, which is entitled Ensuring a Future for Hawaiian Honeycreepers. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm Hanna, and this is Cali. And we basically run sister projects on Maui and Kauai. And so a lot of the things we do are the same, some of the things that are different. And so today we're gonna take you through both projects and what is currently going on and kind of bounce back and forth between the two of us as we go. So the mission of both of our projects differs a little bit, but in a nutshell, it's basically to prevent extinction. We develop and implement techniques for the recovery of endangered bird species, restore their habitat, and promote knowledge, conservation, and appreciation of Hawaii's forest birds, both on Kauai and Maui. So what does this mean we're actually doing? So we do a variety of research and management. You know, our jobs are kind of half research, half land management. Some years it's all research, some years it's all management. I feel like every year we kind of wear a different hat on where the greatest need is at the time for the species that we're working with. This encompasses avian research and monitoring, reintroduction and releases, so translocations or reintroductions of endangered species, mosquito research and control, habitat management and restoration, and all the forms that takes, as well as education and outreach. So our outline for today is we're gonna take you through our history and how we got to this point, our birds, the options that we have in front of us, what strategy the state and the conservation community has embraced going forward, and then our call of how people can help.
Thanks. I'm going to take it from here and jump in with the history, just give you some context for why Hawaii's birds are so special and why those same conditions made it so that they're in such a precarious state. So of course, the important thing to remember in the context of all that evolved in Hawaii is how isolated Hawaii is. It's the most isolated archipelago in the entire world. and only organisms that were strong flyers, so had wings, or rafted on the water, we call that the waves, there's the 3 W's, right? Or came on the winds, managed to get here. And once they were here, they were cut off from parental gene flow and were sort of free to evolve in this new volcanic landscape in weird and wonderful and miraculous ways. And so one of the foremost examples of that is the Hawaiian honeycreeper radiation, in which an ancestral group of rose finches were probably blown off course in a storm, arrived here and became more than 50 different species, filling all of the niches in the Hawaiian Islands that were generated by our pronounced topography, our strong trade wind effect, and the absence of mammals and reptiles. So they were filling niches that mammals and reptiles often fill in other places, but they were also not subject to the predation pressure that mammals and reptiles put on birds. So they flourished in these islands for many, many years and became very, very important to the ecosystem and to the culture of the Hawaiians that arrived some many thousands of years after the birds. So we thought this was an appropriate slide. This is the Pilina talk. The birds are integral to the biocultural landscape of Hawaii. Their feathers were traditionally used to denote royalty, helmets and standards and capes. And they were considered a manifestation of the gods or the intermediaries between the people and the gods. And in the meantime, they were conducting all these important ecosystem services like pollination, like seed dispersal, insect control. And we have a saying in the groups that we work in, the rain follows the forest. Well, the birds ensure the forest and the forest ensures the birds. And without the birds in the forest, we don't have all the important flood control and drinking water storage and everything that we need to call the Hawaiian Islands home. So things did begin to change for the birds when the Polynesians arrived about 1,000 years ago. Polynesians, of course, are mammals, and they brought with them many other mammals, including small Polynesian rats and Polynesian pigs that began to shape the landscape in different ways and have both indirect landscape impacts on the birds through clearing for subsistence agriculture, but also direct impacts on the birds. Many species were hunted, and then the rats themselves were predating on eggs, Polynesian pigs were changing the undergrowth, etc. The magnitude of all of this changed dramatically when Europeans arrived a few hundred years ago. The Europeans just accelerated the rate of land clearing. They brought a lot of very invasive plants with them. They brought larger, more aggressive animals like European swine, larger rats. Some of them are very good climbers, cats. And so the landscape immediately began to change as the pigs spread these weeds, as the pigs dug up burrows, as rats began climbing trees and preying on bird nests. And then what we are going to spend most of our time talking about today is that whaling ships introduced mosquitoes about 1820. And then about 100 years after that, probably in the pet bird trade, diseases that were novel to these birds were introduced, primarily avian pox and avian malaria, and mosquitoes help spread those diseases. So there's a nexus between climate change and mosquitoes and disease. As you know, mosquitoes do not like particularly cool temperatures. So until very recently, mosquitoes were restricted to the coastal areas of our high elevation montane islands. And it's only been very recently, as temperatures have warmed in the islands, that mosquitoes have been allowed to advance upslope. Similarly, in particular, avian malaria, this disease that is carried and spread by mosquitoes, also likes warm temperatures, and its range has been restricted by the cooler temperatures in montane areas. So if you look at the graph here, we have coastal areas, which are considered the mosquito zone. And then we've always had this nice high elevation refugia in the middle of the islands in the upper elevations where the forest birds have continued to flourish. And this line sort of is theoretical line that is driven by temperature that separates the birds from the mosquitoes. And that line is rising, and this area here, and I'll show you another graph in a second, is disappearing. And this is so critical because the honeycreeper group that radiated from that ancestral rosefinch is highly susceptible to avian malaria. 9 out of 10 EEV die after being bitten just once by an infected mosquito. It is a novel pathogen to them, just like the coronavirus was a novel pathogen to us, with much the same consequences, just really dramatic consequences for populations and survival. So to illustrate this a little more clearly, here we have an island like the Hawaii with a lot of elevational relief up to 4,000 meters. And we have the coastal area here where mosquitoes flourish and there are no birds. And then in the middle elevations of Hawaii Island, we have nice forested habitat that birds could perhaps persist in, but in fact, they are not persisting down here because there's too many mosquitoes. And they can only persist above this line in the forests where there are no mosquitoes. And that is getting pushed and pushed up. And eventually, we expect that they will run out of habitat on the Big Island because they'll reach the tree line where there is no more forest. Now, this is an example, say, of a low elevation island like Kauai, where really the mosquito line has already reached the top of our low stature island here on Kauai, which is only about 1,500 meters. There is a tiny little bit of mosquito-free habitat seasonally in the wintertime when our temperatures drop. But the rest of the year, mosquitoes are found throughout the island. And we know this because both Hanna's group and my group are doing active mosquito surveys in these upper elevations. So here's Kauai, here's the Alakai Plateau, which is 1,000 to 1,500 meters. And these hotspots indicate where we are catching lots and lots of mosquitoes as of 2020. And then even you can see this is our highest elevation site, 1,350 meters. We still even caught a few mosquitoes up there in the fall of 2020, which is considered peak mosquitoes season. Similarly, on this map of Maui that shows endangered forest bird range, the dots indicate the numbers of mosquitoes being caught at that site. So we know that mosquitoes are infiltrating these upper elevation refugia that up until now have been safe zones for our birds. So from there, let's talk about who those birds are.
Okay, thanks, Callie. I mean, it's interesting watching the mosquitoes moving up too, just people are experiencing it in their everyday lives. My office sits at 3,000 feet on Maui. And for the first decade I was in this office, we never had a single mosquito. And now we're putting up screens and swatting mosquitoes on a daily basis. And it really is quite shocking that we can just kind of experience that in, one job or one career living in one place. So talking about the birds, we've lost a lot. Hawaii, is often known as the extinction capital of the world. We don't love that title. We want to, be the conservation success capital of the world. And so we're working towards that. But even though we've lost a lot, we also have a lot left to save. Callie can go to the next one. So this slide illustrates the native honeycreepers that we have left. And there's a lot of spectacular birds left that only occur on one island. So single island endemics like anianiao, that's only found on Kauai. And then we have some species like EEV, and apapani isn't actually on this slide, but that occur across multiple different islands. But the majority of the species that we have left are single island endemics. So monitoring these birds, especially a single island endemic that only occurs in these high elevation forests in these small areas far from humans, are very difficult to monitor and do demographic research on. So we do Hawaii forest bird counts every 5 years, everywhere across Hawaii, which entails walking down the entire elevational length of the forest bird habitat on each island, stopping and counting all the birds that you see and hear for 6 to 8 minutes at predetermined locations. And then USGS can calculate for us, what they estimate the population size to be. Unfortunately, with species like kiwikiu and ʻakikiki, where there are so few, when you do those counts every 5 years. 1 year you might detect 3 birds, the next year you might detect 5 birds, the next year you detect 1 bird, and the next 4. So it's really hard to draw a line and see what trajectory these populations were really on. And so for a very long time, we did think that most of these populations were fairly stable, and whether or not they were experiencing small declines, that was very difficult to pick up through these historical bird surveys. Wait, go back one more, sorry. About I guess the last 15 years or so, both of our projects have moved towards really more intense demographic monitoring. So tagging, color banding individuals, being able to recite those individuals, map them, and figure out exactly how many individuals are on the landscape, and then extrapolate densities for that to get another measure of how many birds we think are out there. And both of these measures have very recently pointed to drastic declines for all 4 of these species in both their numbers and their range.
So a case in point of how we're using those forest bird survey data is the Akeke on Kauai. It's a crossbill that has a very interesting foraging habit of splitting open leaf galls. And I'm gonna, so you can see here on the x-axis the every 5-year surveys. And here, the y-axis is the population size. And you can see as we've gone counting those birds, just this free-falling population, that in 2018, the last time we did our surveys, crossed the, it looked like maybe it was tailing out and giving us an estimate of about 1,125 birds. But using those other data that Hanna are talking about, territory mapping and detections of individual birds, we're actually guessing that it's closer to 638 birds, and we get to see if we're right this next year when we go out and do the forest bird surveys again on Kauai in 2023. And to look at this in terms of space, this is the range contractions that have occurred in this species since 1968. So the 1968 points are the ones way out here, and then these are other sequential years, 1980, 2000, say 2005, until in 2012 and 2018, these red detections were so few for these birds in 2012 and 2018 that we didn't bother to draw a range polygon around them. It's just, there's so few birds in such limited space. So we're estimating a 61% decrease in their range. For the ʻakikiki, another Kauai species, we have slightly better data. So let me first of all show you the same graph with the forest bird survey data here, showing a notable decline. The decline in ʻakikiki started earlier. So over the time span shown here, it's not as steep, but you can see that we actually think that there were only a few hundred birds. And based on all these other data that Hanna are talking about, and I'll show you here in this graph, we actually think this is closer to 45 birds. 45 birds of ʻakikiki, the entire species remaining in the wild. And this is the same range contraction you can see over time with the 3 red dots in 2012 surveys. One of them is hidden by my arrow, sorry about that. We only detected 3 birds in 2012 and again in 2018. So this area here has been considered the bastion of the ʻakikiki. We had 100 birds there, 35 breeding pairs in 2015. And we have been doing active monitoring, like Hanna described, with color bands and everything at that site since 2015 to count the number of pairs. And we have just seen it free fall over the last 8 years, such that this year there were 2 lone males and no breeding pairs. And this has really caused alarm bells to ring throughout the conservation community, as you can see, or as you can imagine. This graph here is our estimate of adult survival based on color band recite. So you mark birds and then you go out and you see how often you recite the same individual and you can get an estimate of its lifespan. So this is the chance that it survives from 1 year to the next. And this is the average survival here in red. So crashing annual average survival. And then this here is interannual variation, which is in fact the best model. So some years they do a little bit better, but in general, they have been doing very poorly and even more poorly as late, such that the chance that a bird makes it from one year to the next is about 25% right now, primarily due to those mosquito-borne diseases.
Okay, it's a similar story on Maui. Kiwikiu is our most critically endangered species. We do have a few left. We think there's somewhere between 135 and 150. And we can see through the larger outline on this map what we estimated their range to be in 2011, and then the contraction in 2017. And then we have a slight additional contraction that has gone on this past year, because it was actually 2022, those counts were repeated on East Maui. And all the little red dots is kind of what that size population would look like, that's all the individuals that we have left. While we do have a few more than 45 and not quite as dire as ʻakikiki, kiwikiu is the slowest reproducing honeycreeper that we have. Their population growth, it's just like, help me help you. They are really long-lived. They lay one egg, they raise one chick a year, and that chick stays with its parents for up to 6 months to a year and a half. Not helping, not like helping them raise another young, but just being dependent. And so with a super slow population growth, being able to get this species to rebound or repopulate any additional habitat areas is going to be a really slow process. So these graphs, show the same story from slightly different data on some population viability analyses that we ran, looking at the more intense demographic data we had with productivity and survival. And basically, no matter what way you look at it, the population as a whole, the Eastern population, the Western population, all the data we have is, suggests that these guys are not going to persist in any meaningful way, not even as much as a decade in the future. And, there's so many things that are affecting these birds. As Cali said, the disease and mosquito issue is what we think is the most pressing and what we think is the biggest driver right now. But these are also on small islands. They're also just plagued with small populations in general, this low reproductive potential that I talked about with kiwikiu, but the other honeycreepers don't have, that large of a reproductive potential either. We've got, invasive predators as well. So these birds do have a lot of different things working against them right now. And then our other bird, just quickly with the same point count data showing the decline, the ākohekohe. This is has the largest population of any of these 4 species that we're talking about. They're estimated to be somewhere between 1,300 and 1,700 individuals left, but they actually have the largest range contraction. So we think that the ākohekohe is potentially more susceptible to avian malaria than kiwikiu, because they actually have a smaller range and are able to persist at some of those slightly lower elevations that kiwikiu are. So trying to figure out, how to take those data and that point count data and demographics and actually figure out a timeline to extinction for these birds is really difficult. And a time to extinction will obviously allow us to plan our, mitigation and implement different techniques in order to save them, depending on how much longer we think they're going to be around. For about the last, I was going to say 6 months, but gosh, I think, Callie, it's been like 12 months now. There have been a group of experts getting together a lot with all of the available knowledge on all of these species and trying to predict what the probability of extinction and when that's going to happen is for each of these species. ʻAkikiki is obviously the one that is going to go first, and the one that people are pretty much 100% sure is not going to be able to hold on in the wild without any kind of immediate intervention. The other species might have a little bit longer. ākohekohe might be able to hold on, a little bit longer than everybody else, but these estimated lines also have a tail end in next year. So with, additional habitat change or a really young, warm year, the landscape could change under our feet in just 1 or 2 years and move that estimated time to extinction forward.
And just before we go on to our options, also, we cannot underscore the chance that there could be a stochastic event like a hurricane that would in a heartbeat change the landscape, which has already happened on Kauai leading to the extinction. of several species. So that being said, the same group of people that Hanna has been talking about have been reviewing the different options for the birds. What can we do? And so, of course, there is always the do nothing option. Leave them in place, continue to monitor, hope that things change for the better. And here we've put the 4 species we talked about and a slightly different way of looking at the same data from the forest bird surveys, this time with a little curve that gives you maybe a little bit more hope that they're going to level out and hang out there at the bottom and do okay. But we've tried that before and it hasn't been particularly successful. So most of us in the conservation community are rooting for other options. And these, I'm going to go through these one by one. So one option is we can safeguard the species in captivity. We can collect any number of individuals, enough hopefully to have a viable population, so you don't have too much genetic inbreeding or any of those issues, and put them in captivity and hold them there for a future to be decided. So the future could be as long as some of other options come available, or it could be really that you expect that bird is going to be in captivity for the foreseeable future, and you're going to invest heavily in conservation breeding and creating a stable captive population. So here we've put some pictures of an effort to bring kiwikiu into captivity. This is also something we talked about for all the other species. Another option that could be done in conjunction with captivity or standalone is translocation, which means moving species from one place to another. So for example, Hawaii being the lowest elevation island of all has probably the most mosquito infested habitat, whereas both Maui and Big Island having higher elevations might have more mosquito-free habitat. So you might want to move Kauai species to either one of those islands where they could perhaps do better in mosquito-free habitat, but also fulfill ecological roles that have been vacated by species that have gone extinct on those islands. So many of these birds have close relatives that are no longer in existence on the Big Island or on Maui, for example. That being said, I think at this point, the chances of moving birds to Maui from Kauai are pretty slim, given the trends that Hanna is looking at. And so the biggest candidate for a translocation or recipient of a translocation is the Big Island. And there is a lot of research ongoing currently to determine the extent to which the Big Island still has mosquito-free habitat. And as I said, this could be done in conjunction with captivity, where you would move birds into captivity first and then translocate later, or just direct wild to wild translocation. The effort that is getting a lot of attention right now is to control the threat in the wild in these birds' native landscapes, and that's by mosquito birth control. So interfering with mosquito reproduction to the extent that in the absence of reproduction, the mosquito populations crash. And the tool that we are most heavily invested in at this moment is a tool that uses a naturally occurring bacteria called Wolbachia. It already occurs in mosquito populations throughout Hawaii and other insect species as well. And when males and females have different strains of this bacteria in their cells, the males were unable to fertilize the female's eggs. So then the female mosquito she lays inviable eggs and there's no second generation. And so we are exploring ways that we can introduce different strains of bacteria, of this bacteria Wolbachia, into the males and then release males on the landscape to usurp populations with females. And that would hopefully deal with the threat of mosquitoes. The timeline for this strategy is lengthy. So there's as you can imagine, introducing mosquitoes, which are a prohibited species in the Hawaiian Islands, has a lot of regulatory hurdles. Using it as a biopesticide has its own registration issues with the EPA, et cetera, et cetera. There's a need for public comment. So many of you participated in the public comment process that is happening currently. There's also environmental assessments ongoing currently on Maui and Kauai to really scope out this project. And it looks like we may have trial releases next year and first implementation in 2024. So keep this in mind as you think about those graphs that Hannah showed you with the time to extinction, because that plays into what we think our options are. So here's the species, here are the different options: translocation, bring into captivity, some combination of them. Does it go into captivity and they get released back out into the wild once the mosquitoes are disease-free, gone and the forest is disease-free, or does it need to stay in captivity? The answer for all of these is different depending on the species and the projected time to extinction of each of the species, because some species have more time to wait for disease-free habitat. Other species are in immediate crisis and maybe need to be brought into captivity. So those are portfolios of choices that we as a group have been weighing.
Okay, so based on that kind of gloom and doom suite of options, we do have a strategy moving forward. I think, at the end of 2019, it was hard to even give a talk anywhere because translocations had failed and the birds were tanking, and we were like, the technology wasn't there, and we really did not know what the next step was going to be. But right now we do. So we can go to the next one, Cali. First off, both of our projects, as well as a large group of other organizations, has come together to form this Birds Not Mosquitoes group in order to push this incompatible insect technique forward and get it out on the landscape. This isn't obviously the only thing we can do, because as Cali showed on that last slide, this isn't ready now, and it wasn't ready a year ago when there were more than 45 ʻakikiki left. And even when it is put out on the landscape, because it's a new technique, we're also not sure when it might be effective and how effective it might be in the long term. But this group is working really hard to push that timeline forward as quickly as possible. And both of our projects are going to be key with the deployment of this incompatible insect technique on Maui and Kauai. What this is going to look like, we go to the next one, is we're basically flooding the environment with these incompatible male mosquitoes that, as Cali said, will then, present many more mate choices to a wild female than the potential few compatible males that are out there. She will hopefully not find her few compatible males, and it will, over time drive the population down. However, this is not a genetic technique. This is not a gene drive. This is not going to suppress the mosquito populations as soon as you stop releasing male mosquitoes. So it is a huge project and it is a huge undertaking. And these male mosquitoes are going to have to be released into the environment on an ongoing basis for as long as we want to have that positive effect of reducing the population. So where we are right now is we are still in a lot of the research and development of this Wolbachia incompatible insect technique project. The mosquitoes are being developed. Cali's team and my team have been capturing mosquitoes in every little nook and cranny of both islands, trying to look at what strains of Wolbachia already occur on which islands, what strains will then be incompatible with the mosquitoes that we already have here. We're working with partners on the mainland to be able to rear millions of male mosquitoes to release. And I never say this, and I don't even think I realized this when we started this project, but looking at this rearing picture and all those mosquitoes in that jar, male mosquitoes don't bite. So if anybody on here doesn't know that, we aren't releasing, additional mosquitoes that would pose a threat to the birds or people. And then when we figure out how to rear all those mosquitoes and get them safely into Hawaii, we have to figure out how to deploy them into the wild where the mosquitoes are breeding to present those wild females with that choice of that incompatible male. We're not 100% sure what that's going to look like yet. It could be pedestrian deployment on the ground. It could be some sort of helicopter use, or it could be hopefully some sort of drone deployment, because if we look at the next slide, Where we have to put these mosquitoes is also quite daunting. So this is a proposed map of what an initial treatment area we might want on Maui. So this covers the areas the birds are in now, but also all the areas downslope from where the birds are, where we think the mosquitoes are breeding and then moving up into that forest bird habitat. We also want to control mosquitoes in areas in addition to where the birds are right now, because as we talked about before, those tiny little populations are not viable even if we controlled the threats in their current range. So we also want them to be able to expand into the other forest areas that are available. But each of those little blue dots would be a point where we would need to be releasing these mosquitoes every week, twice a week, something quite intense. So that is what Cali and I are working on now on a daily basis, is putting together teams and strategies and working with all of those partners in the Birds Not Mosquito group to figure out how we can actually get this out on the landscape. However, we'll go to the next one. This isn't ready tomorrow, as we said. So the federal and state entities did get together and come up with a plan for all of these 4 species in the interim. Everybody is in agreement that in order to prevent extinction of all 4 of these species, we need mosquito control in the landscape, and we should push mosquito control forward as quickly as possible. However, it might come too late for all of these species. So I'll let Cali do the 2 Kauai species first.
Sure. So Akeke, as I noted earlier, has a population of close to 700 birds, we think, and a projected timeline of extinction that is hopefully after Wolbachia incompatible technique is available for landscape level control. So the earliest time we think that Akeke could go extinct is right when we think we might have landscape level control for mosquitoes. And so they are also a notoriously difficult bird to catch, and they have done in the past poorly in captivity. So we do not think that translocating them or keeping them in captivity are particularly viable strategies. So for them, we actually are planning to do the watch and wait and monitor strategy while we wait for mosquito control, and be ready to act if necessary, if things go south further than or faster than we think. For ʻakikiki, with 45 individuals left in the wild and those trends I showed you, the plan is next spring to go and capture the remaining, or as many of the remaining ʻakikiki as we can, and bring them into captivity, where we will, at a minimum, hold them until Wolbachia IIT landscape control of mosquitoes is in effect and disease has been suppressed. And additionally, we'll try to breed them in captivity given how small their populations are and the need to bolster the population.
Okay, so for kiwikiu, similarly, we are also going to be bringing birds in because anything could happen next year to bring that timeline to extinction forward. And they also overlap so much with our timeline for Wolbachia deployment that we're not sure we'd have enough birds left. The reason that keep bringing in kiwikiu in, though, is a little bit more pressing than Akeke. I can never, Cali's birds pronunciation is so much harder for me, is that because we talked about that slow population growth with kiwikiu, that if we lose half of them between now and when Wolbachia is deployed, they still might not be able to rebound from that. There have been kiwikiu in captivity before, so we are talking about going out and capturing enough birds in order to have a viable captive population. We're hoping that that exact same captive population will be re-released in less than 5 years. Best case scenario, we bring in 20 pairs, we wait for Wolbachia to go out on the landscape, and then things are successful, and then a couple years later, we release those same 20 birds. Kiwikiu do quite well in captivity. They survive, but they don't really breed. And so it's, you know, overly optimistic to think we'd be able to save them through a captive breeding program, but we can at least keep them in safe holding until we can put them back in the forest. And so we're going to be capturing up to 10 birds. Actually, this fall, winter, October, November, December, and they will be in the captive holding facilities here on Maui at Maui Bird Conservation Center. And then next September, we will, in 2023, we will go out and hopefully get the additional 30 individuals to set up that population. ʻAkohekohe is a little bit different. So ʻAkohekohe is really the one species that we are the most worried about, that there are enough individuals left that they could potentially source a successful reintroduction elsewhere. So we're doing ongoing research and collaboration with folks on Hawaii Island to figure out exactly what's going on with disease on Hawaii Island, to see, you know, how much longer those forest areas are going to be safe, and whether or not there is a suitable area to move a good number of ʻakohekohe to Hawaii Island and let them set up a second population there. That being said, ʻakohekohe also don't really like to be in captivity. They haven't done very well, and there have been very few, I think 3 that have ever been in captivity. And so when we do our kiwikiu captures, we're also going to bring in 6 or 7 individuals so that the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance can develop and, you know, adapt the management they've had in the past for those birds so that they can thrive in captivity if we get to this point with the next suite of species and have to bring in more of them in the future.
And so speaking of the next suite of species, we have talked about the 4 that are in absolute crisis, but there are a number of other honeycreepers and non-honeycreepers on both islands that have more robust population sizes. And we're not talking about them because we do have a good amount of confidence that landscape level mosquito control will work in time to save those species from these kinds of really hard conversations. We won't have to investigate translocation for anianiao or captive breeding for amakihi because we will be suppressing disease, the biggest threat on the landscape. That being said, there are many ways that we need a lot of public support and involvement in the process. So first of all, one of the biggest issues we face with honeycreepers is they're a little bit sight unseen. The areas where they still persist are way back in roadless areas, and a lot of Hawaii doesn't know they exist, or if they knew they exist, they think they're extinct already, and they don't realize that there's hope and that there's still time to do things. So please share your knowledge and aloha of them with your friends and family throughout Hawaii and beyond. We both have active volunteer programs. We'd love to take you out in the forest and show you what we're doing with mosquito surveys or other efforts, but we also can, at least in my program, I'm sure Hannah's program is the same, can accommodate remote volunteers. For example, one of the biggest things we're doing right now is reviewing trail camera data that can be done from anywhere. Every little step you take to address climate change is helping to solve the problem. Climate change is the elephant in the room, right? We will be dealing with mosquitoes in perpetuity unless we can solve climate change. So turning out the lights and taking the bus, all those things matter. And addressing it with your legislators, all those things matter. There, at this point, as I mentioned, are active environmental assessments going on both islands that have public scoping periods and periods for public comment. Please participate in the process of these environmental assessments and other things that come up that will influence the course of permitting, legislation, and funding for these birds, because the resources are finite and limited, and this is a very expensive, all these solutions are very expensive. So every voice matters. And then that champion endangered species, you know, here in Hawaii and elsewhere, because at the end of the day, we're all fighting the same battles and the same good fight. If you live here in Hawaii, we actually believe that there's a significant lowland contribution to the mosquito problem upslope. We believe that a lot of the breeding activity between males and females occurs at lower elevations, and then females migrate upslope to lay their eggs and larvae. So, and especially if you have mid-elevation homes or you have cabin country kokee at higher elevations, you can have a big impact on mosquito populations by preventing standing water in and around the areas that you live in and vacation in, turning over buckets, planting suitable vegetation, just making sure you don't have a wheelbarrow left out to collect water, a tarp, all those things matter and can really have a big impact for the birds. So there's a lot of ways that you can be involved in the process and help us work towards a solution for the birds. Do you have anything to add there, Hannah?
Nope, that's great.
Yeah, so with that, the biggest thing you've already done, taking the first step, which is joining our presentation today. So thank you very much for your time and attention and listening, and you're learning a little bit about our birds.
Thank you both so much for that. I really appreciate all the information that you just shared. It's a really important topic. It's tragic to hear about the state of these bird populations, but also really inspiring to learn about the projects that you're both leading to do what can be done to try to save them. So thank you for that. At this point, we're just going to open up for questions from the audience. And so people can either write in their questions in the chat, or feel free to just unmute your microphone and ask questions directly.
Question. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, please go ahead, Danny.
How much do the feral cats, how much damage do the feral cats cause to Hawaii's bird population?
Do you want me to answer that, Callie? I can answer that. Yeah. Sure. So, you know, free-ranging cats on the landscape is obviously an enormous problem statewide. Whether or not, you know, free-ranging cats in the high elevation forests, removing those cats would actually, you know, move the needle on allowing these species to recover on their own, probably not. That being said, we support every bit of legislation to remove cats from the landscape because they are in those high elevation forests. Callie and I both work with variety of different groups on both islands to try to find solutions with both the cat advocate communities and the conservation communities to try to do something about reducing the number of cats that are out there. But as you probably know, it is a really tough fight. And for every 10 letters you get from the conservationists supporting a piece of legislature to, you know, remove cats from a certain area, you get 100 from other cat loving folks. So they are playing a role. We would love to see them gone. Controlling predators is part of both of our field crews' work, but are they going to drive one of the populations out completely like they are in certain seabird areas? Probably not. So it's not, you know, the main focus of our projects right now, while disease we know could make, you know, end them tomorrow.
And I would agree for the Maui and Kaua species, that's largely true. I do believe that they're a pretty big factor in the Pilina recovery. In addition to, yes, in addition to habitat degradation on the Big Island. And you know, for some of the lower nesting species like Kauai elapaio, cats may be having a big impact, but the species I spoke about today nest so high up in the trees that the cat predation is a minor factor if effective. Yeah. There's some questions about in the chat.
Yeah, this is Robert Brose at Miss Dragon Farm in Virginia. I just wanted to let folks know that, particularly the researchers out there, to let you know that this kind of symbolic species and the impacts on the environment that are associated with it is exactly the type of work that Melanie Brose was trying to do. And so there's a small University of Hawaii Foundation set up in her name. I put the link up, and I would encourage you to try and take advantage of that to get grad students funded, because it is a UH Foundation account that's been there for a few years, set up with the EEBC, and it hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, had a student take advantage of it. And this is, I can speak as Melanie's representative, absolutely the kind of work that matched her vision of what she wanted to do. So for your call for help, I'm actually able to say there are small grant monies available for students to do work on something like this. So try to bring something.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take one more from the chat and then we'll get to the hand that's up. Kathleen asks, what is the mosquito lifespan? Do they mate more than once during their life? So my understanding, and chime in if I'm not getting this quite right, Hannah, is that female mosquitoes can live several weeks depending on the temperature. They can actually hibernate if not a whole lot is going on and just kind of chill out for a while. And they do mate more than once, whereas males have a shorter lifespan. Is that your understanding too? We are not mosquito experts, so this is all stuff we're gleaning.
Yeah, entomology is our new hat. It is, yeah, not our area of expertise, but that is my understanding as well. The males won't live more than a week and, you know, can't survive more than 24 hours without eating.
Right, so as Hannah says, they do not bite, they don't take blood meals, they're nectarivores. And so therefore they're actually pollinators in their native ecosystem. Okay, somebody has their hand up. Lauren?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. Thank you. That presentation was wonderful. I learned a ton. That was great. I was just wondering, so I guess you're sort of trying out different recovery techniques, and maybe you don't have the data to do this yet, but I was just curious if you'd heard about the IUCN green status of species as a tool for measuring the effectiveness of different techniques for species recovery. And if you had heard of it, if that was something that you could see yourself using in the future, maybe once you've tried out the mosquito technique to measure your success. Thank you.
I can answer that. Yes, we have heard of that, and we have worked very closely with folks from the translocation and reintroduction IUCN groups. One of the biggest challenges for us right now, and the most difficult thing about making these decisions, is you might only have enough individuals to make one decision. And so that's, you know, it is very challenging. You can't, you know, we'd love to trial like bringing some kiwikiu in, moving some to the Big Island and seeing if they do well, leaving some where they are, and, you know, then figuring out what would be the most successful. But if next year we only have 75 left, you know, we might only have one shot at it. So yes, those kind of structured decision-making, you know, tools are awesome, but we haven't applied it in exactly the same way they've applied it with other species. There are a couple just simple questions in the chat too. So with how do we protect the birds in captivity? So all the birds in both captive facilities are in mosquito-proof aviaries. So they're transferred from the field very carefully in mosquito-proof boxes, and then through, you know, double mosquito-proof, you know, gates into these mosquito-proof aviaries. And also, if malaria does sneak into an aviary in a captive situation, avian malaria is treatable if you catch it quickly. So if a bird was being held in captivity and started showing signs of avian malaria, you could treat that bird. The reason we can't treat birds in the wild is you have to treat them, I think it's for a week every day. So you'd have to have those birds like in the hand. But if we have brought a kiwikiu back from the wild that was showing signs of malaria, and it was able to be treated in captivity and is now still in captivity and has recovered. And then the other question was, has the Wolbachia strategy worked in other situations? And yes, and we didn't put the slide in this presentation about all the other places around the world that Wolbachia has been used, but it's used for human disease control. So it's used in Aedes mosquitoes, which are a different species. So that is why it wasn't a tool that we could just take off the shelf that had been deployed elsewhere in the world and used for our mosquitoes, because they had to take those methods and apply them to a new species and figure out how we could do it for Culex.
It's been used very widely in the US, in the continental US, and across Asia with good effect. And so we showed you a graph that shows the mosquito population falling, and in those areas with those human diseases, they have showed the incidence of disease crashing also as soon as the mosquito populations fall. So we have good reason for hope with this tool.
Yeah.
The next question is really, so let me get Kathleen's, and then I think Sky questions for you, Hannah, because you've already done so much work that way. It is part of the process that we went through meeting with experts last fall to determine what our portfolio of strategies would be, included meeting with cultural groups who feel cultural Hawaiian groups who feel very strongly that the birds should remain in Hawaii. And so at this moment, all of our solutions are within Hawaii solutions. I think we are being strongly advised to consider those solutions and give them a good try before we investigate non-Hawaii solutions.
Yeah, I'd second that. And the second part of that question is just as where they originated. You know, Cali mentioned the rose finch, you know, that maybe got blown over or lost, but that was, our species look nothing like what they originated from. So they originated here. You know, these species evolved here. There isn't anywhere else that we could necessarily take them to. I do think about, you know, hey, we need some offshore islands that are mosquito free or something like they have in New Zealand, but avian malaria is across the world. So, you know, having a high elevation Hawaiian rainforest somewhere else in the world, none of those places have come to mind. Even,
yeah, there aren't that many mosquito-free places.
Yeah, even besides the fact that it hasn't been looked upon fondly to move them outside of Hawaii. But the reforestation question. So our project actually worked on we did a lot of experimental restoration for about 7 years, trying to figure out the most efficient and effective way of reforesting leeward Haleakala. And we built a fabulous forest, and we feel like we have great tools and methods now to do it quickly and efficiently and build a great habitat for birds. Unfortunately, those areas are quickly being swamped by the mosquitoes that are moving upslope. So all of the restoration work that we have done, you know, putting in special food plants for kiwikiu, trying to introduce those into areas where maybe the habitat wasn't perfect, it worked. But now the mosquitoes are in those areas. And so we can't use them yet, but hopefully we will be able to use them in the future. And then kind of also with the how people, it kind of fits into how people can help too, you know, besides just knowing what these species are and, you know, having a love for them and knowing that they're part of Hawaii, is we really encourage people to plant native vegetation at middle elevation areas. So once we save these birds and we control mosquitoes and Wolbachia is out across the landscape, we want the birds to be able to expand. And we don't want to then bottleneck them up into the high elevation forests, because those are the only native forests we have left. And those have been the only areas that we have been protecting. So we really encourage a lot of mid-elevation restoration. And we work with several nonprofits that are doing a lot of mid-elevation restoration. So once the birds are able to come down, there will be some forests for them.
And so on Kauai, the strategy, and I think there's areas on Maui where this is also true. The Kauai the strategy has been fencing with ungulate proof. So ungulate proof fencing the best remaining pristine watersheds, so that when mosquitoes are controlled, the birds have a good home. So these are very tall fences that exclude pigs, deer, and goats from the best native forests on Kauai. And luckily, the forest is so good in there that there is not a lot of additional management that needs to happen. Once you remove the pigs, the native vegetation just takes off on its own. There are some areas where weeds have had a much larger impact that we are doing a lot more aggressive weed control with our partners at the Akeke Resource Conservation Program. So habitat restoration is part of the bigger strategy to make sure these birds don't just survive, but thrive on our islands. Stream diversions, Hannah.
Yeah, Skippy, I don't have any data to say that stream diversions have had a negative impact on birds. You know, the stream diversions are a bit lower than where most of our birds are also. So it's not that it wouldn't have any impact potentially on the forest, but we don't have any evidence that it's affecting them so far.
And Allison, I think the last question might be for you.
Indeed, and maybe that's a good point we'll wrap up the Q&A at this point in time. We're at the 3 o'clock mark now. So yes, Lauren has asked whether we can share the recording of this talk, and yes, indeed, we will do that. We have been posting all of the recordings from this Pilina webinar series on the CNS YouTube channel. And so as you receive the invitation for the next talk, you will also receive a link that will take you right to this recording. And on that channel, you'll be able to see all the recordings from previous months as well.